Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Been quite excited to make this presentation. Today we will be talking about the 5 steps that you can take to transform your organization into a data-driven one. There are 3 key takeaways that you can expect at the end of this session. Number 1, understand what are the challenges that CDOs, data leaders face today. We look at some important trends. Number 2, understand the concept of data maturity and see how it can be crucial in putting you on the firm path towards data-driven journey. And number 3, understand the 5 steps, which is the title of the webinar. We'll link all of these 3 together at the end using a live case study so that you can find out how these learnings have been put into practice at an organization. Quick introduction, I'm Ganes Kesari, co-founder and chief decision scientist at Gramener. At Gramener, we help solve business challenges by presenting insights as stories. We bring together the best of analytics, storytelling, and a low-code platform to help organizations end-to-end in their data journey. We serve over 100 clients, the likes of Microsoft, EY, Deloitte, and we have a team spread globally, 200 plus people who are passionate about serving these clients and passionate about making everyone data-driven. I stand for simplifying data science for everyone. That's the mission I've been writing and speaking. I contribute to Forbes Entrepreneur, and I've taken the stage at many leading events around the world. So let's get started by talking about buzzwords. I like talking about those cool terminologies which are tossed around, and we don't have a paucity of this terminology in the data space. If I were to ask you, what is that one term that you've been repeatedly hearing about in the last year, ever since the pandemic started? You can type the answers into the chat window. We would like to keep this interactive. And while you type the answers, and you can type in whatever comes to mind. And you're going to have polls periodically. We have 3 polls for each of the sections. Anytime you have questions, do type it into the chat window. I've requested Sanish to monitor them and call them out. And when we pause for the polls, that's a good time to answer some of them. And all others we'll take at the end of the session, but do type it into the chat window as and when you have it. So let me see what some of you are reacting. What are some of the words that come to mind? So remote work, digital transformation. Yeah, digital transformation is what I wanted to talk about first. So Tom Fishburne, the creator of this brilliant marketing cartoons, marketonist, says, perhaps we are showing a lot of urgency without clarity. Last year, around the same time, he came up with this cartoon. Let's take a look. When we say digital transformation, we often equate it to the tools or some ways of working. It runs far deeper, right? So it's about how you engage your customers remotely and how you take care of your employees, how you manage the supply chains, and how you run your operations by using data and digital as a lifeblood of the organization. That's what digital transformation is all about. Thankfully, over the last year, there has not just clarity which has emerged around this definition, but we also have seen good progress which many organizations have made. So let's talk about how it has impacted the data space. Gartner recently published the 6th annual Chief Data Officer Survey. So there they found that organizations that have taken up the digital transformation initiative, there a majority of data leaders have been either directly leading or are heavily involved in these initiatives. And so much so that Gartner says that almost the other role, which is seen as very close to a chief data officer, the chief digital officer, the distinctions between these 2 roles are blurring. And thankfully, the acronym CDO is the same one. So perhaps in the future, we'll see a confluence of these 2 roles. So that's one trend. Number 2, in the past year, Data leaders have reported that the size of their teams have grown. Almost 50% of the people have said that the teams' sizes have grown, and their budgets have also expanded. In a year where we have seen so much of uncertainty and a lot of budget cuts, growing the team and putting in more money means a lot. So that's what organizations have come around, and they've started investing a lot more, particularly during a problematic year. So based on all of these trends, Gartner says that by the end of this year, in 75% of large enterprises, the chief data office will be a mission critical function, quite like IT, HR. So it will be independent. Increasingly, we are seeing that the chief data office is reporting into the business functions roles like CEO, COO, and they're partnering deeply with CIOs and CISOs, the chief information security officers. So these are some quick trends to understand, and this is what is happening right now. So while we see all of this promise of data, there are also challenges. There's increasing investment, but these chief data officers are seeing a lot of challenges as well. Before we look at the challenges, I first wanted to poll the people here. What are the biggest challenges you are facing in your organization? So I'll be launching this poll now, and there are 5 options you should see on your screen. Let me start the poll now. Yeah. So the 5 options. Are you seeing challenges in identifying the most impactful business initiatives to pursue? Is it a shortage of skills that's troubling you for execution of data science projects? Or are you having difficulty in quantifying ROI from your initiatives? Or is it the improving data literacy for most people, particularly the non-tech people within the organization? Or are you having challenges with the culture? How to make people to use data and use it for decision making? Which of these challenges are the biggest for you today? And then we'll compare this with what other data leaders have been talking about. So far, okay, let me not influence it. I see 2/3 have voted. We give a couple of more seconds, and then I'll close and show you the results. So far, I'm seeing 2 categories where most of the responses are coming in. Quantifying ROI. Understandably, that's a major area. Number 2 is influencing cultural change. This has been a favorite for many years. This has shown up as a top challenge in surveys, I think, as far as I remember, for about 4 to 5 years. The other numbers are slowly picking up some steam. So let me close the poll right now. I see most of them have voted. And here are the results. So 36%, almost equal number for both ROI and cultural change. And other 3 challenges equally split. Okay, so let me close the results. Let's find out what the data leaders have been calling out as the top challenges they face. So like I mentioned earlier, while investments in data is increasing, the benefits or the business value organizations get is not increasing at the same rate. And in fact, there are 2 groups which are emerging. McKinsey says that there are 2 clear groups which are leaders and laggards, and the gap between them is widening. There are a small island of companies which are extremely good at getting value to get the best business benefits from their data investments, whereas there are others who are seeing some progress, but the benefits are not proportionate. There's another industry survey which says that only 37% of executives report that they've created a data-driven organization. This is a key challenge as well. So what are the 5 roadblocks that typically executives stumble? Number 1, culture and change. I think most of you have reported this challenge as well. How do you convince people within an organization to adopt new technology, whether it is machine learning or data storytelling? Changing the ways of working is difficult. Number 2, funding and resources. How do you secure funding for your initiatives? How do you demonstrate that the earlier investments are paying off? That's where ROI comes into play. Understandably, I think these 2 you've called out. In fact, these 2 are the top challenges reported in the CDO survey last year. So you're close on the market in terms of the same pulse as that of CDOs. Number 3, data literacy, educating people in conversing and being comfortable with data. Number 4 is people and skills needed to execute the projects. And 5, data science strategy and aligning with business initiatives and picking the right projects. These are the top 5 challenges. Now, while these are most common, and this might resonate with a lot of people in this call, the challenges that your organization faces will be very different from what another organization which is less or more mature might face. So these challenges vary throughout the journey of an organization's life cycle. So if we roughly split this into 5 stages, level 1 being early stages in the data journey, level 5 is more mature. In the early stages, organizations ask questions like, which business problems should we solve first? What are the projects we should pick? What skills and tools do we need? Level 2, when they've done few projects, we have seen some small levels of success. Most of these could be pilots. How do you move them into production? How do you align your data strategy with the business goals? Number 3, how do you tap into internal and external data? When you've exhausted what you can do with the quick wins, unstructured data or different other public data, how can you tap into those? And how can data storytelling help improve decision making? And then when you go to the higher levels, there are other challenges like governance, repeatable execution. Most people within the organization are using it, but it is not done in a repeatable way. Business ROI, how do you clearly link it? And level 5, data should become a habit. People should subconsciously start thinking of data when they have to make a decision. And how does it influence the investment organizations make? So you can see that an organization in level 1 has very different challenges compared to level 5. So now there's one undercurrent which runs through all of this. So if you want to find out where you are in this path and what should be the challenges or the questions you should tackle, that metric can be a useful indicator, like a bellwether. What is that factor? It's data maturity. Gartner says that data maturity is a prerequisite for making the most of your data investments. When you're running analytics, visualization, storytelling projects, data maturity is that connecting common thread across the organization. In simple terms, there are 3 parts to data maturity. 1, it shows you your capabilities. What are you really strong at? It identifies the gaps, weaknesses, and which of these are most important for you right now. While there could be many gaps, which are the most important ones for you? And third, benchmark against the industry. It is useful to see where you are versus your peer group, not versus a completely different industry or digital native companies like Facebook or Google. So how do you do that right benchmark? All these 3 are the elements of data maturity. So I like to say that data maturity is like a compass on your data journey. It helps you find where you are, check progress periodically, and make sure you're traveling the right direction. Because if people get lost, they may find out only long after that, like it could be weeks, months, or years. So data maturity can help you discover that you're going in the wrong path sooner. So the second section talks about how data maturity helps, and we'll dive a little more detail into that. Before that, I'm going to be launching a question. I want to find out how many of you here are familiar with data maturity, or you've already done it for your organization. So there are 3 options for you. I've launched the poll. Number 1, yes, you've taken some assessment now or earlier. Number 2, you've not done it, but you are interested. Or 3, no, and you don't see value in it. Let's see how many of you fall into the third category, and I hope that whoever falls into the third bucket, I'm able to convince you by the end of the session that you should explore it. So far, I see a lot of responses, 0% for 3. So it's good. We'll give a couple of more seconds. Most responses currently are for second option. Not done it, but would like to explore. This session would be ideal for you to understand more about it and look at the path to implementing it. Let me close the poll now. Here are the results. 80% say no, would like to explore. 7% Let's connect again at the end of the session. Hopefully I convinced you by then. The second section is about getting into the details of data maturity, what it is, how do you assess, and what it really means. For this, first we need to understand the 5 levels of maturity. Earlier we talked about roughly level 1 to level 5. We'll go a little more detail into that based on Gartner's data and analytics maturity model. So here, level 1, we've already looked at the questions, so I'll run through this quickly. It's quite similar. Organizations in early stages, they approach data transactionally. There's lack of trust, and analysis is done in a as and when needed basis. Level 2, some support, pockets of usage, but it largely lacks leadership support. Level 3 is where business executives, there are some teams who are strong users, some executives who are supporting it, but standardization is missing. Level 4 is where data leadership roles like CDO, CAO come into the organization. And there's a very clear linkage to ROI for all of their initiatives. Level 5 is where they become a data leader in their industry. Data is not just influencing, but it is central to the strategy. So when you look at these 5 levels, you would be surprised to know that most of the organizations in the industry today fall into levels 1 and 2. Earlier, when Gartner did this survey, they found out that 87% of organizations are in low maturity, levels 1 and 2. This ties in with the earlier example, the earlier quote we had seen, that only very few organizations are data-driven or data leaders. So why do so many organizations get stuck here? And how can you navigate these 5 challenges we've looked at? Let's look at data maturity and see how it is a starting point. How do you assess your data maturity? It's not very different from the competitive tests like SAT or CAT. So you have a series of questions, you go over that. They cover different aspects, different disciplines within data, and they're tailored for the different stages of the data lifecycle. When you go through, and there are several people in the industry who run this, and at Gramener, we have come up with our own research and methodology, and we have identified, we have put together a data maturity assessment. I'll walk through the methodology we follow, and this will give you a good understanding as to how most people in the industry approach it, because the approaches are quite complementary. So there are 5 dimensions of data maturity. So when you talk about this overall score of, say, level 1 or 2, that number in itself doesn't mean anything. That score can be broken down into these 5: vision, planning, execution, value realization, and data culture, which are 5 stages. How you can define the business vision, how do you plan your initiatives, how are you executing it, how are you realizing value from your projects that you're executing, and how are you propagating data culture. So you can see that these 5 are the 5 stages of the data science value chain, and they go one level detail to look at the elements. The elements, these 12 elements that you see, are those that bring in actionability. So if you want to improve, for instance, your vision and the strength of vision, how do you work on the clarity? How do you work on the business alignment of strategy? Or if you want to improve execution, should you work on the processes that you have, or your data analytics capability, or the data engineering capability? So that way, this assesses all of these. The 70 plus questions I mentioned above, they cover all of these elements, and you can roll it up to the 3 levels: your score for each of these elements, score for the dimensions, and overall score. So that way, that's what helps you find out the weaknesses and priorities. I'll show you a quick example of what you can find out from the assessment and what the report out looks like. This is again a sample which we share with our clients. Number 1, the maturity score. Let us say you are at level 2.02 on the scale, which is the first level. Level 2, within that, now you go to the second hierarchy, which is the 5 dimensions. You can see that there are some where the organization is scoring high, some where it's scoring low. And now the third hierarchy is the element. So the 12 elements are coming in here, and the score for the elements is there. And then you also find out what is the priority. It's not just low scoring versus high scoring, but even if an element is scoring low, is it important for you? What is your priority for it? And in case your priority is high and the score is low, that is a concern area. Otherwise, you could defer it and work on it later. And the third aspect of this is the recommendation part. Once you understand these things, what should you do next? The short term, mid term, and long term. And what are the actions across each of these 5 dimensions? So this gives you a clear path on what all you should do to improve your data capability. And for instance, it says that in the short term, you have to improve your vision and execution. Planning or realized value will come in at a later stage. This is a hypothetical example. So based on the organization, based on the priorities, this recommendation is provided. So now we can see data maturity is not just a number. It's a detailed methodology in Excel, and it can help you come up with recommendations. So in summary of this section, people might ask, it's one common question I get from leaders is, okay, I invest efforts to move up from level 2 to level 3. What does it mean for me in terms of business benefits? So does it lead to a top line improvement, bottom line improvement? How can I quantify and justify the efforts? The International Institute of Analytics did an interesting study here. They looked at 72 key metrics, the performance indicators of organizations like the revenue, growth in revenue, stock price, a lot of such factors. And they looked at the analytics maturity of those companies. When they did the association and the correlation and analysis, they found out that there was strong association for 59 of these factors. Most of these factors go up when an organization's maturity goes up. So that was a conclusive study which was done. Similarly, Deloitte also in their study found out that when organizations reach higher level of maturity, they significantly exceeded their business goals compared to their peer group. So that's another validation of the need for maturity and the business benefits you can get out of it. It is not just cleaning your data, the chief data office or your data practices. It has very clear business benefits also. So now let's look at the third section, which is how you can use all of these inputs. When you understand the challenges, when you have, say, data maturity and you understand the broad recommendations, how do you steer your organizations on the data-driven path? So that's the third section. We look at the 5 steps. Step 1 is reflect. Reflect on the organizational strategy. You start off by looking at the corporate vision and what is the business strategy. Based on that, you define how you can use data to support that vision. So coming up with your data strategy based on that. A closely related activity here is assessment. We've already talked about data maturity assessment. When you reflect, you want to look at the big picture and you want to find out where you stand. Combining these two will help you move on to step 2, which is align. Now that you understand the big picture and where you are, how do you align your efforts and pick projects which help you meet those business priorities? You start off by brainstorming and identifying those strategic programs. There are several approaches which you can follow. And once you come up with a long list of programs, strategic programs, then you can apply the levers such as impact, feasibility, and urgency to prioritize and come up with that list of quick wins and strategic projects. And by the way, I will be showing some of these toolkits or approaches on the right hand side, those thumbnails that you see here. Each of those we have expanded into a 5-minute whiteboard video, which is available for free on our YouTube channel. I'll share the links to that towards the end of this presentation. So each of these points on how to go about identifying your projects, how to build the strategy, which we saw in the earlier slide, each of these are covered in 5-minute detailed videos. The other activity in step 2 is to build a data roadmap. Once you've prioritized and looked at the different initiatives, how do you plan out a 6-month or a 1-year roadmap, which has not just the business use cases, but also data initiatives? For instance, you need to strengthen your delivery process. You need to improve the career path of your team, work out a detailed career path of the team, and plan some upskilling programs for them. So you need to have a combination of business projects and data capability initiatives. Step 3, after you pick the projects to execute and you know the strategic priorities, you have the projects. Now, how do you go about executing it? That's where the define part comes in. You define the people, process, and technology that you need to execute it. And then you define the delivery framework and how do you go about the life cycle? How does it integrate and improve collaboration with the rest of the teams? For instance, the business teams, the other technology teams, and the other stakeholders in the process. So that's where understanding the different roles when you talk about preparing people and then the different skills that you need. There are 5 skills which we've talked about, we've published, those 5 roles that every data science team needs to have. That video is available as well, like I mentioned earlier. So this would be useful for you to find out whether you have the skill sets within the house or how can you augment them and how do you execute your projects. Similarly, the governance process on how it will go through this methodology, whether it is agile or whether it is any other custom methodology that you take, there are some commonalities. How do you define the execution process? Step 4 is adoption. Once you execute the project, you need to make sure that the end users come in and embrace the solution. That's a common challenge we've seen earlier. Data literacy is low in most of the organizations. Unless you make people comfortable with data, the adoption of your solutions is going to be very low. Recently published a post where we talked about how data literacy can be your insurance policy to ensure success of your data initiators. So data literacy improvement is a key part of the step. And you need to measure ROI. And this has to happen throughout the process, but this is a critical milestone here. You measure what is the business benefit that you can quantify from your project. If you build a machine learning project, how does it impact the top line or bottom line? You need to be able to quantify that. Only then, the second cycle, when you're picking your projects, you will get funding for it. So this is a critical step as well. Step 5, finally, is radiating your initiatives. Once you've built and you've successfully moved them to production, how do you expand your user base? How do you take it to new teams? How do you manage change within the organization? And how do you build a culture of data-driven decision making? That's what the 5th step is all about. So your project or your initiative doesn't end after a successful delivery. You need to see how you can radiate and spread this message within the organization. So these are the 5 steps. We've looked at useful toolkits, frameworks for each of these. And this is what we call radar. If you pick the first letter of each of these steps, it forms the word radar. And that's the data to value methodology, which we follow. And this is something which we've shared in the public domain with enough detail, which anyone can adopt and start embracing to see value in their initiatives. So this one key point here is it's a cyclical process. It doesn't stop at radiate. Once you do one cycle of radar, then it naturally leads to the second cycle where you go back to the drawing board and you start reflecting again, which could be 6 months later or a year later, at that logical point when you have delivered projects in your first initial roadmap. You go back and find out what are the next set of projects you need to pick up, which ones will give you value. How do you align with the priorities at that point in time? You will have learnings from your earlier projects. How can you build it in and refine what you're going to execute in the second cycle? So this way, there are multiple cycles of radar that can help you move up in data maturity. So how does it address the 5 challenges? The first section that we had seen. These are the 5 challenges, just to refresh your memory. These we had gone through. And reflect addresses the data science strategy challenge. Align addresses the funding and resources. How do you pick the right projects and secure funding? Define is for the people and skills. Adopt is for data literacy. And radiate is for culture and change. Now, we have seen that these 5 steps can be useful, are universally applicable. How are they different from how organizations typically execute their data science initiatives? Let's look at a quick example, a hypothetical example. Let's look at a retail chain who wants to start off on their analytics journey. They have data in a spreadsheet, and the people, the managers, they get together and they say, okay, we have data, and people have been asking for forecast of, say, sales forecasts. So we can quickly cobble these together and then plot them and use Excel to apply some regression techniques and build a forecasting algorithm. With that, they share it with the sales teams. So this is very typical of how organizations approach. You have some data, you start looking for which projects or which needs have been around for a while, and then you apply that and you collaborate with your business teams and do it. At first sight, nothing wrong with it. But when you go in and look deeper, there are some implicit assumptions you're making, which may not be true. Number one, you're thinking that forecasting is the initiative which is aligned with your business strategy, that this falls into the path the business wants to take. Number two, lack of sales forecasts. You assume that that's a problem. Yes, some people have been asking about it, but is it the most important problem you need to solve today? You've not validated. And number three, you have not shared with the sales teams the approach they can use to action these results. What should they do with those statistical outputs that you create? The complete planning hasn't happened. The same organization, if we were to approach and use the 5-step process, how will they execute it differently? We start off with reflect. The leadership sees the supply demand bottlenecks. As the organization is scaling up, they see that this is a challenge the company is facing. It is stopping them from growing faster. That's a business priority. And they ideate on different projects and they find out that sales forecasting, yes, that's one of the things they would like to do, but additionally supply demand optimization. And there are other initiatives like scenario planning. In certain scenarios, how should I react? Analytics can help with that. So based on this, you align and you pick supply demand optimization as the most important and business impactful one. That's the power of this step, where it tells you and it helps you make an informed choice. And then you define by looking at what data do you need, what people do you need, and how do you collaborate and bring the stakeholders early on into the process. And then once you execute and build those solutions, you have a planned adoption phase where you improve data literacy, you run trainings, and you tweak the processes to make sure that the outputs of the algorithms can go back into the business workflow. And finally, you do the walkthrough and you do the change management to make sure this propagates across the organization. You can see the differences between this and the earlier slide. The earlier slide, it was just execution based on whatever is at hand, whereas here it's a much more methodical one. It's more likely that you choose the right problem and you execute more correctly. So this is the power of the 5-step radar methodology. And like I mentioned, it is a cyclical process. You start off with this, and with every cycle, your maturity keeps going up. The business impact that you get and the trust in the system, all of these keeps going up. So this is kind of a cycle which builds on top of itself. And this is a positive spiral. So this is the benefit of the 5-step methodology. So I like to say that this is like an ongoing journey. A ship which is setting sail, it should periodically be discovering treasure islands, and from then on again set sail and go on to the next ambitious target. So let's run the third and final poll for this session, which is which of these 5 steps do you think you need help with? After this, we will go into the industry case study. We looked at the 5 steps. Which of these do you need help with? And this is a multiple choice question. If you think there are 2 steps you need help with, you can choose more than one. See responses coming in. Currently, I think this is aligning with the earlier poll. I'll share the results. I see one of those is really picking up. So currently, align is at the top. How to align on business priorities. Okay, a few more seconds. Majority of the responses are coming. I'm closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Here are the results. Most of you need support and align on business priorities and to build a roadmap, followed by defining the execution process and adoption. Radiate is a stage which probably also could mean that it also could be a reflection of the data maturity level of your organization. It's good to know these results. Now let's move on to the final section, which is the industry case study. We will use this to tie all the learnings, the three learnings of this session together. So this was a client, a logistics leader in the US. So they have multiple warehouses with presence throughout the country in several states, and they have several dozen warehouses. They run the cold storage warehouses. The challenge they were facing a couple of years back when we spoke to them was to become data driven, and to the business problem they started off with was, how do I improve the operations, operational efficiency? How can I use data science to deliver better business value? So initial stages, they had a very robust data engineering practice. It's pretty good. And they had a good BI, the business intelligence and reporting practice. So they had the basics in place. They were aspiring to become more data science driven and see how they can infuse intelligence into their business processes. So there were several questions like how to choose the most impactful initiatives. What kind of skills do I need? Do I need data scientists, or what processes and tools? How do I measure ROI? And how do I need to organize the data science teams? We already have a BI practice. How should this sit? Should it be a part of that? How should you organize it? And how do you promote collaboration with the rest of the organization? And importantly, how do you manage change for an organization which is not in the traditional technology kind of an adopter? How do they manage change and improve adoption? And they have a lot of people who come from the logistics and warehouse background. So these were the challenges started off with. Let us look at how we applied the 5-step radar methodology in the very first cycle. When we started engagement, how did we approach it? So first, reflect, we identified that optimizing warehouse operations and improving customer satisfaction were the priority that year. And they wanted to look at those strategic programs which directly fall into the warehouse operations. While there were other nice to have projects, they were deprioritized. So that way, the project picked, when a lot of projects were evaluated by the stakeholders, ultimately the final project which was picked was reducing warehouse turn times. Once this business problem was finalized, then the approach, how do you solve it using data, was the next question. So machine learning was looked at as a possibility. And then what skills do you need? How much time do you need? What is the budget needed? All of those things were defined. So eventually, a system to predict the right appointment schedules was built using machine learning. When customers come into the warehouse to drop off or pick their goods, what is the best appointment for them, so that it reduces the turn time? If you have an SLA of say 2 hours, how do you make sure that every time the customer comes in, it is less than 2 hours? There were cases where it was going to much more than that, 3 hours or 4 hours. How do you cut that down? Instead of giving a 3 p.m. slot, should you give a 5 p.m. slot? Can the machine make a recommendation based on learnings? So that was the approach, and a solution was built. This is an example of what the solution recommends. Like I mentioned, it says you've selected 3 a.m. whereas 5 a.m. is the best time, and this is how it impacts, and this is how the load will be. And if you choose this, this is how, this is what your likely turn time is going to be, and this is how this appointment will impact all other appointments in the day. So there's a lot of scenario modeling and optimization which is being done there. This was started off with 3 warehouses, piloted with warehouses, and there were a lot of best practices in terms of involving the warehouse managers from day one and having them participate in the build throughout. So that way, adoption of it was much, much quicker than most organizations. And wherever there was a need to convince teams down the line, they were able to talk about the actual usage and how it will improve their jobs. So that way, adoption was rising, and we brought in storytelling to improve the adoption. There were a lot of flyers and sessions which we shared, similar to the comics we are showing here on the bottom right. So there were a lot of tools used to improve the adoption, software aspects. And finally, radiation. Once this was done, this was rolled out across the entire organization. And there was change which had to be managed. So all of these were done in the first cycle. So now, after the first cycle, this became kind of a repeated process, and we started building a pipeline of initiatives. How do you drive innovation? So that's how the subsequent cycles went on. And if I just cut directly to today, where is the client and how are they doing now? Today, when it comes to the reflect phase, apart from improving operational efficiency to the next level, there's a priority taken to look at revenue impacting use cases. What are the other areas beyond warehouses we can apply data and improve it? So there's an appetite to do more with data. And we are looking at the current year's priorities. And based on that, aligning with the projects and continuously doing an experimentation. So when you have 10 to 15 ideas, we put them through an innovation funnel, which we've designed jointly with the client. And there are projects which are validated along the stage. Only some of them make to the final stage. And a lot of these others are tried out to make sure that we are not losing out on any other opportunities. And data maturity was used throughout. And when we recently assessed, we found out that the organization was at level 3. And they have streamlined governance, a steering committee which meets quarterly, and again, a lot of best practices in terms of how to do it repeatedly. Adoption. For this solution, which I talked about earlier, the appointment scheduler, there was a 16% reduction in turn time. And there has also been an ROI tracking framework which has been put together to quantify the benefits. While, say, the appointment scheduler can reduce the turn times from, say, 3 hours to 2 hours. But what does it mean in terms of financial impact? How do you track it? How do you quantify it? And if you've invested X dollars into this project, how soon will it pay off? So those are the aspects which are covered by this ROI framework. And finally, there is a strong adoption of data-driven leadership. The leadership, there are more people at the top level who have come into the fold and who are driving many of these initiatives. So that is a great example of radiation beyond this initial group which started cycle 1. And they also are doing marketing of these both internally to the teams, saying that these are the success stories. We need to do more of these. And also sharing this in the industry, saying that we are an innovative organization. We have adopted data science and are able to get a lot of benefits and improve the experience for our customers. So that way, that's where the organization is at today, about 2 years into the journey. And this is how the 5-step process, data maturity, and how you execute it in a cyclical process can help you. So that brings to the end of the presentation. So this is the toolkit I mentioned earlier about. We talked about the data maturity assessment, and many of you mentioned you would like to explore it. So we have a free version of this maturity assessment. I talked about a full-blown version with 70+ questions, an online survey which takes about 45 minutes. This is a 5 to 10 minute version of the survey, which covers all the 12 elements we talked about, and will quickly tell you where your organization stands. Once you take this assessment, you will get an automated email giving you the score and some useful resources and talking about characteristics of organizations at your level. Do take it out. And we also share a lot of thought leadership. I mentioned about the whiteboard series. Each of the points I talked about, we have 5-minute capsule on it, targeted at people like you, on how you can use it and how you can implement them. And there are other articles and useful resources. Yeah, thanks again for attending. I love the interaction, and thanks for being very active throughout the session. Like I mentioned earlier, at the end, please do answer the survey, and look forward to seeing you in one of the future webinars. Bye.